So in this video, I want to walk you through the bargaining model from Chapter 5, which helps us to understand how different institutions can affect economic outcomes, in particular allocations between different players in the economy. So it's a simple model. It involves just two people, Angela the farmer and Bruno, who is an exploiter or a landlord. There are two goods, grain and Angela's leisure. And we should realize that this model, well, it's about agriculture here, could be about any kind of productive activity. It's very simple, but also meant to be quite general. And we're going to look at four different institutions that have an effect on how Angela and Bruno both behave, how much is produced, and how that is distributed. So first, Angela is an isolated individual, someone outside of society, say out on a remote, in a remote prairie or something like that. Then Bruno comes along, and he's a coercive person, and so he is able to extract some of the produce that Angela produces. This is a world without government. Then in the third institution, we introduce private property and freedom of contract, so a pretty limited form of government, and see how that changes things. And finally, we add to that situation democratic politics, where policy can affect the allocations that are achieved. There are a couple of special ingredients for this set of models. One is quasi-linear preferences, and the other is the survival constraint, and we'll talk about those first before we go into the models. So quasi-linear preferences really just refers to a specific shape of indifference curve. It refers to indifference curves where each curve is sort of a carbon copy of the other, shifted upwards in the vertical direction. And that means that the marginal rate of substitution along these curves is the same for any given amount of the, in this case, the horizontal axis good. So here we have hours of leisure per day on the horizontal axis and bushels of grain per day on the vertical axis. And for any given number of hours of leisure that are taken, the marginal rate of substitution is going to be the same no matter what indifference curve you're on. In math, a utility function that has that property is like this one here, where the utility of grain and leisure is equal to grain plus the square root of leisure. And the fact that these two terms enter additively is what we mean by quasi-linear. So this feasible frontier is familiar from Chapter 3, and it tells us how much grain Angela can produce depending on how many hours she devotes to free time, where the hours she's not devoting to free time she's spending farming. So allocations that are outside the feasible frontier are technically infeasible. Those that are inside the frontier are technically feasible. But we add in an additional wrinkle here, and that's a biological survival constraint. And what this says is that there's a minimum amount of grain that Angela has to get in any given day in order to survive to the next day, and that amount of grain is increasing the more that she works. So this curve slopes upward as we go from Angela taking more free time to less free time. And in fact, it crosses the feasible frontier up near 12 bushels of grain. And that means that there's some amount that Angela actually can't work. She can't produce enough food to kind of be able to survive at a very high level of work. And so allocations that are below the survival constraint are biologically infeasible, and that reduces the size of our technically feasible set to this pink lens-shaped area. Those are the sort of quantities of free time and bushels of grain that Angela could produce and still stay alive. So the first institution we'll look at is Angela just off by herself, farming without any sort of social relations with anyone, and so that means there's really nothing to constrain her from maximizing her utility, from finding the highest possible indifference curve that she can reach given the feasible frontier that she has, and that's just the point illustrated here where MRS equals MRT. Angela works for 8 hours and produces 9 bushels of grain. And that's substantially more than what she needs to produce to survive, or needs to consume to survive, rather, when she's working for 8 hours a day. So 8 hours a day intersects the survival constraint at around 3.5 bushels. So she's doing much better than just surviving in this situation. And so the ovals just illustrate that there are parts of the feasible frontier that are not accessible to her because of the survival constraint. That's not impacting her choices here because her preferences, her indifference curves are tangent to the feasible frontier within the survival constraint. But you can imagine that if she had different preferences, that might not be the case, and then we'd have to think about what the survival constraint means in that case. So the second institution, coercion, another person arrives on the scene, Bruno, and he's a nasty guy with a gun, and that means that he can extract surplus from Angela. He can force her to work any amount of time that he would like, and he can make her give away to him all the grain that she produces, except the bare minimum that she needs to survive. And so this is an institution that has some resemblance to slavery, where slaves are sort of only allowed a subsistence amount of food, and all of the surplus that they produce is expropriated from them. There also are examples of this in the early 20th century in communist regimes of various sorts. So we can imagine that, say, initially Bruno says, well, Angela, you need to work for 16 hours a day and only have 8 hours of free time. And if we look at the feasible frontier, we will see that when Angela takes only 8 hours of free time, she produces 11 bushels of grain. And so we're going to show an allocation of grain between Bruno and Angela by a point like A here. And so what A means on this diagram is that Angela is working for 16 hours, and the 11 bushels of grain that she produces are divided between her and Bruno according to where the point sits on the vertical axis. So that means that Angela gets 7 bushels of grain, which is just enough to keep her surviving, and Bruno gets 4. And so a question is, if Bruno wants to extract the maximum amount of grain that he can from Angela, how much should he tell her to produce? He wants to make the distance between the feasible frontier and the survival constraint as large as possible by telling Angela how much she should work. And so, as it turns out, the place where he can extract the maximum amount from Angela is where the marginal rate of transformation of the feasible frontier is the same as the marginal rate of substitution of the survival constraint. And I'll show you in a second why that's the case. We represent this allocation with point A, and as I mentioned on the previous slide, A says that Angela gets 4 bushels of grain, and because she's working for 11 hours and producing 10, that means that Bruno gets the remaining 6 bushels. So 6 bushels of grain is the most that Bruno can extract from Angela, and we should note that coercion, of course, leaves Angela far worse off than she was before. Before she was consuming a number of bushels of grain above what she needed to survive, and now she's been pushed down just to the point of barely being able to survive. And so Bruno's role in this simple model is purely exploitative. He's not contributing anything to the agricultural enterprise. All he is doing is using force in order to extract surplus from Angela. So this is a bad situation. And so let's just look at a couple of different possibilities for Angela's work time and see why they tell us that MRS of the survival constraint should equal the MRT of the feasible frontier when the amount of surplus that can be extracted by Bruno is at a maximum. So if we imagine that Angela is working for 14 hours and taking 10 hours of free time, we can sort of draw the slope of the feasible frontier and the slope of the survival constraint in green here. And we'll see that the MRT at 10 hours is less than the MRS. And this means that if Angela were to reduce her working time, the fall in output, which is what would be indicated by the MRT, is less than the decrease in the amount of food that she would no longer need to be able to survive, represented by the MRS. So that means that by working a little bit less, there'd actually be more possibility for Bruno to extract grain from Angela. If we look at a converse example, if Angela works only for 4 hours and takes 20 hours of free time, now the increase in output from working an additional hour is quite steep. The MRT is steep here. Well, the MRS is shallow. So if Angela were to work an additional hour, she wouldn't really need that much more in terms of grain in order to survive, but she'd produce quite a bit more. And since everything above survival that Angela produces in this institution goes to Bruno, he's going to want her to produce more when MRT is greater than MRS. And so if you sort of split the difference between these two examples, you see that when MRT equals MRS, that's the point where Bruno is getting as much as he possibly can. So now let's move on to the third institution. Now we have a government, and the government is going to enforce two laws. So it's a limited government. It's very lightweight, if you like. So there's private property in land. Someone who owns land can do with the land what they like. In particular, they can decide whether to let someone farm it and sort of determine conditions under which that would happen. And they can also exclude people from using it. Second, there's freedom of contract for everyone. So economic relations have to be entered with the consent of all parties concerned, and those contracts will specify the obligations of each party, such as payments to be made or activities to be undertaken, and those are, once you enter into the contract, those are legally enforceable. What you can't do is coerce someone. So you can't Bruno can no longer be the person with the gun. Instead, Bruno is a landlord. He's the person who owns the land. You might imagine that this would be something that would result from, he sort of comes on the scene as a warlord and seizes the land, and then after many generations, his progeny are the landlords. And Angela is someone who doesn't have land. She only has her labor to offer. And so in this institutional setting, Bruno and Angela might enter into a contract in which Angela works the land in exchange for a payment to Bruno of part of the output in terms of grain. So how does this look on the diagram? First, we're going to make things a bit more interesting by giving Angela an outside option, Z, or a reservation option. And this is an amount of grain that she can get without having to work. We can think of this as the opportunity cost of her working for Bruno. So if she were to work for Bruno and get less than this amount of grain, for example, for sure she would not be interested in that. As it happens, Z also lies on one of Angela's indifference curves, and in particular the reservation indifference curve. And so while Angela is happy to get 2.5 bushels of grain if she's not working, because it keeps her alive, if she has to work, there are going to be other bundles that will require substantially more than 2.5 bushels to get her interested in working for Bruno. And in fact, her reservation indifference curve lies above her survival constraint. So Bruno can no longer, with this outside option, force Angela down to the survival constraint. And so the feasible set is now bounded by the reservation indifference curve and the feasible frontier. All the allocations in pink, Pareto dominate Z. So if Angela and Bruno can agree to an allocation in the pink area, Angela will be interested in taking that on because it will give her at least as much utility as she gets from Z, and maybe a little bit more. And Bruno will be happy because he'll be able to get some of the grain that Angela produces. So we use the term joint surplus to refer to the gain that both parties have access to by virtue of their entering into a contract together. We also call this the gains from exchange. And just as with the example involving the survival constraint, the joint surplus is maximized at the point where the marginal rate of substitution along the reservation indifference curve is equal to the marginal rate of transformation along the feasible frontier. And that joint surplus is about 5.5 bushels of grain. We draw a line between points C and D that represent the allocations that Bruno and Angela could agree on that have the property of maximizing the joint surplus, having her working for 8 hours. And we call this line the contract curve, or the Pareto efficiency curve. And it's a line in this case because of this assumption that we made about Angela's preferences being quasi-linear. So all of the indifference curves between the reservation indifference curve and the one up at the top that C sits on have the same slope, the same marginal rate of substitution when Angela is working for 8 hours or taking 16 hours of free time. And so that means that the contract curve follows a straight line. If preferences weren't quasi-linear, if they had a different shape, then the contract curve may not be straight. It may be curved or squiggly or something like that. So the point of using the quasi-linear preferences in this model is just to make this contract curve look nice. And so allocations on the contract curve Pareto dominate all the other allocations in the feasible set because the joint surplus is maximized. And so you can imagine that if you pick some other bundle in the pink area, we know that that total joint surplus is going to be lower for that allocation. And that means that Bruno and Angela could bargain over the difference in surplus that would put them onto the contract curve, and both of them could potentially, say, get a little bit of that, and then they would feel like they would want to move to an allocation on the contract curve from one off it. And so the model predicts that they'll be bargaining to the contract curve, but not exactly where on it. They may bargain to point C, where Angela would get all of the joint surplus, or point D, where Bruno would get it, or to some point in between. And we don't really know for certain where they're going to end up. It depends on the kind of bargaining power that they each have. There are things that we haven't represented in the model that probably would influence whether they would end up closer to C or closer to D. So, for example, if Bruno has many potential workers that he could hire besides Angela, if the labor market is very loose, Angela may not be able to get him to agree to a point much higher than D. Conversely, say if Angela is the only worker who's around and Bruno is very dependent on the surplus that he can get from her farming this land, she may be able to bargain with him to a point that's closer to C. Another point to note is that since the reservation indifference curve is above the survival constraint, the joint surplus is going to be lower here than when Bruno could coerce Angela, and that's not a bad thing. That just reflects the fact that Angela now has better options than coercion. So the fourth institution adds the possibility of democratic elections to private property and freedom of contract. So we might imagine that we have a government that's democratically elected by universal suffrage. And we might suppose that, just like in real agricultural societies, there are more people who are working the land than there are landlords. We might imagine that Brunos have, say, 5 plots of land each, and that there are enough Angelas to work all of them. So that means that Angelas will dominate in a democratic process, and they can use their political power to change the terms of the economic bargaining power that they have, and perhaps get a better deal for themselves. And so ways in which workers historically have been able to increase their bargaining power is through unions, minimum wage laws, maximum hour laws, child labor laws, unemployment insurance, and so forth. There are many sort of pro-worker types of legislation that have been tried. So here we're going to imagine that the legislature passes a law that mandates a maximum working day of 4 hours and a minimum pay of 5 bushels. So they're going to say that point D prime here is the allocation that's the minimum that Angela can get, and also the sort of maximum in terms of the amount of hours that can be worked. And that bundle is going to be on another indifference curve of Angela's, higher than the reservation indifference curve. And so since that bundle gets her up higher than the bundle on which Z and D are found, she's happier. However, this leaves less total surplus for Bruno. So Bruno can get a maximum of 2.5 bushels of grain from this deal. And so if we imagine that maybe he was able to bargain Angela before, close to D on the On the contract curve, he'd be pretty unhappy with what he's getting out of under this new legislation. And so, interestingly, at point D prime, with Angela working only 4 hours, MRT is steeper than MRS, and so D prime is not a Pareto efficient outcome. It's not on the contract curve. And so that means that there is the potential that is being prevented from happening by this legislation of a better deal for both of them. We may think that despite the fact that D prime is not efficient, it may be fairer than D. So remember that Bruno still isn't really bringing anything to the table here. He has property rights, but he's not providing anything other than use of the land for production. So we may feel that yes, it's fair for Angela to get a little bit more than she got before, even if it means Bruno gets a lot less. So Bruno may feel some regrets about this situation. He could have made Angela as well off as the legislation by bargaining to, say, point E, which is on the new indifference curve that Angela has under the legislation. Maybe he could have offered that instead of the legislation, but of course bargains like that are sort of difficult to enforce. But it's also possible now that Bruno might ask Angela to collude with him. So he may say, why don't you work for some extra hours and we won't tell anyone, and you can have point F, which is above your new indifference curve, and I'll also be better off because the distance between C and F is larger than the distance between the feasible frontier and D prime, so I'm going to get more surplus out of the deal, and you're also going to get a little bit more, so if you don't tell, I won't tell, and maybe they would agree to that. It also could be possible for them to modify the law so that it would say that workers and landlords can bargain for additional work hours and compensation above the sort of statutory level of 4 hours and 5 bushels of grain, and everyone would probably like that deal better than the existing law. An alternative legislative proposal that isn't discussed in the book, but that is very familiar to us from real life, is that workers might get a minimum wage of, say, 3/4 of a bushel of grain for every hour they worked. And we can represent that minimum wage using this dashed purple line on the diagram. And what that's going to do is restrict the set of feasible allocations a little bit more than even D prime did. And so now the set of Pareto efficient allocations that are possible for Angela and Bruno to reach are represented by this new contract curve from C to D double prime, still where MRS equals MRT. And so allocation D double prime gives Angela the same utility as D prime, but has more hours for Bruno. And it does this by not imposing a restriction on the number of hours that Angela works. It just gives it just restricts the sort of minimum amount that she can be paid. And so any minimum wage, as long as it cuts through the original set of contract curve allocations, will lead to efficient bargaining to a Pareto efficient solution somewhere on that contract curve. And so what we've learned is that there are a number of factors that determine what kind of allocation we're going to get in this simple economy. First, we have technology and biology that limit the set of feasible allocations. And then on top of that, we had four different institutional settings that help determine which of the allocations would be economically feasible. Those allocations depend on what the different parties' preferences are, and their bargaining power, or their sort of ability to strike a bargain that's on the contract curve that is either more in their favor, or if their power is low, more in the favor of the other person.